Welcome, everyone, to the Week 13 Fantasy and Betting Recap Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined as always by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Just like always, we will not only recap the Week 13 action, but we will do it with an eye towards Week 14 because ultimately, it's not just what happened, but what matters is how do we apply that to the upcoming week and those matchups. Before we dive in, there are two teams that will be on bye for Week 14. So after losing 6 teams last week, we only lose 2 this week, the Arizona Cardinals and the Washington Commanders. Cardinals coming off the nice win over the Steelers, and the Commanders, I think they could use a bye after giving up 45 points to the Miami Dolphins. Ryan, we are blessed this week with a potentially historic matchup given the low game total. Let's talk about maybe the most hapless game of the season.
Yeah, we got a real barn burner on Thursday night with the Steelers and the Patriots. Mitch Trubisky's Steelers, no less, Josh. Steelers are 6-point home favorites. Game total was 32 points earlier this morning. I'm going to start with the Steelers real quick. I lost my biggest survivor entry last week, taking Pittsburgh. I didn't really like it going in. I left the window open up till kickoff because I wasn't really, I was worried about one game path, and that was the Cardinals were going to be physical in the trenches like they were against Dallas. I noticed that early in this game. James Conner had 100 yards on the ground against Pittsburgh, which is, I think, New England's path to victory here is, if they're going to do anything here, it's going to be on the ground. Offensively, Mitch Trubisky, Matt Canada's gone, so that's a positive for this offense. But with Mitch Trubisky in instead of Kenny Pickett, the volatility which was already quite high is like even higher now. So no confidence in the Steelers offense. Their defense will have to win this game. Do you have any thoughts on Pittsburgh, Josh?
So one quick note, we talked about the game total. It's now dropped to 30 points. Top of my head, I haven't ever seen a game total in the 20s. I assume you haven't either. So we might get potentially the first game total in the 20s where it's already been driven from 32 down to 30. With the Steelers, one thing that I think is interesting is since week 9, Jaylen Warren has the most rushing yards in the NFL, 426. And Najee Harris is actually close behind at 348. He's 4th highest. So the Steelers have 2 players in the top 4 for rushing yards over these past 5 games. And I think that's at least slightly notable in a game where they are favored by a full 6 points. And there's not too many positives we could say about that pass game with Trubisky now at the helm.
And to your point with the game total, I'm not sure if I remember one in the 20s, but 30 on the dot, I think is the lowest I've ever seen that wasn't related to like a significant win game. And by significant, I mean like 30 miles an hour sustained win. So this is bad. And this is still like an under or pass kind of game, because the Patriots defense is good. They haven't been the problem in recent weeks, but they just got shut out at home by the Chargers. That's not good news. Offense is astonishingly bad. Bailey Zappi is not really an upgrade over Mac Jones. I'm not sure I would know what to do in this situation either if I was New England. Ramondre Stevenson's likely going to miss some time, which means Ezekiel Elliott's now thrust in the fold too. So the news is not getting better for New England. Is there any positives here, Josh, offensively for the Patriots?
I don't really have any. We'll start to Mario Douglas in fantasy probably just as a flex option. He should return from his concussion that he suffered 2 weeks ago. Ezekiel Elliott is a waiver pickup. We'll talk about him more tomorrow on the waiver show. Everyone should look at Nick Botiford's waiver wire article to learn more about that. And just a fun factoid for that Patriots-Chargers game. The Chargers scored 6 points and covered the 5.5 point spread. So I think that's actually that's pretty notable. You don't see a 5.5 point spread covered very often with 6 points. So yeah, I think that shows the state of this Patriots offense. It's hard to keep a straight face when talking about them at this point.
There's a fair chance that's the only time that's happened in the history of sports betting. Fair chance. Oh, that's a good point, Josh. I love that. Ravens versus Rams is up next. The more interesting game, still a little bit lopsided. Ravens opened as 7.5 point home favorites. They're now down to 7 point home favorites. Game total's down too from 44.5 to 43. Baltimore's coming off their bye. I've been less impressed with the Ravens offense than most people have. The run game's great. That's because Lamar Jackson's a dynamic athlete. We talk about this all the time. Lamar Jackson's a good, efficient passer, but he's not really a voluminous one. That said, I think there's some opportunity for ceiling against the Rams this week. What do you got here, Josh?
Yeah, I think the player that I'm going to be watching here will be Keaton Mitchell. The 7th round rookie led the backfield, or just kidding, I believe undrafted rookie either 7th round or undrafted. Either way, no draft capital,
Sure.
175, 180 pounds. But he did lead the backfield in snaps, carries, and routes run in week 12 for the first time this year. I think that momentum probably carries at least somewhat over into week 14, but that's what I'm going to be looking for at this point because I agree. It's not really a passing offense we can get excited about outside of maybe Zay Flowers now that there's no Mark Andrews. We've kind of discussed at length about how Isaiah Likely is just a tight end streamer at this point, and that until we see it, we shouldn't be ranking him or treating him as anything more than just in that conversation.
Great across the board there, Josh. The Rams have been genuinely impressive over the last 2 games. They scored 37 points against the Cardinals 2 weeks ago, and more impressively, 36 against the Browns this past week. That's 73 points over the last 2 games. One thing of note, I've been talking about Matthew Stafford, how he's been driving their success all year. One thing that caught me yesterday is on the play that Puka Nacua broke. He actually pulled away from defenders at the end. I haven't seen that today. That was very interesting. Has me recalibrating him a little bit. But I do think the Rams are in trouble here against a much better, a well-rounded, elite Ravens team. What are you thinking about the Rams offense here, Josh?
Yeah, I thought the interesting note here was the difference in usage between Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. Kupp actually led the team with 8 targets for a 24% share. Puka did have 7, though. He was close. But the big thing for fantasy is you might say, well, should we have expected Kupp to have the bigger day? No. The average depth of target for Kupp in this game was 3 yards downfield. That's kind of like in between a running back and a tight end. Puka Nacua's average depth of target was 15 yards. He was getting looks much farther downfield. So I think that's kind of interesting, where if that's kind of how they want to use Kupp now that he's 30 years old and a long injury history, including multiple injuries already this season, it's going to be pretty hard for him to have those massive spike weeks in fantasy if he's pretty much playing the running back tight end role with his ADOT.
Josh and I will be releasing a how to win your fantasy playoffs guide later this week. Wednesday evening, maybe Thursday morning. We're going to dive into advantageous matchups. I'm going to spend a lot of time on defensive matchups. One of the things that that's going to be in there is Matthew Stafford has a pretty good streaming opportunity in Week 17 against the Giants. Next up, Josh, Bears versus Lions. Bears open as 4-point home underdogs. They're down to 3-point home underdogs, which makes sense to me. I think that's where it should be. Totals down from 45.5 to 43. This looks like this could be a weather game with 20-mile-an-hour winds and some precipitation, maybe some rain, maybe some snow. And as you know, Josh, I've been higher on the Bears than most people for weeks now. I think they're a couple plays or two from being right in the wild card race and probably being in the driver's seat in that situation. I think they're a middle of the pack team right now. And they gave Detroit everything they could handle a couple weeks ago. You've been on the correlation between DJ Moore and Justin Fields. That's something that I've written a few times in prop markets lately. What else you got on the Bears?
Yeah, just for those that want the actual stats, DJ Moore, his past 6 full games with Justin Fields, has averaged 25 PPR fantasy points. That would be a number that's better than everyone not named Tyreek Hill this year. The Lions, when you adjust for schedule and opponents faced, are the 11th easiest matchup for opposing wideouts. So it should be another huge DJ Moore game. He will definitely crack our DFS player pool for top plays when we give that out on Saturday. The one thing that I'm really going to be looking at is the health of Deonta Foreman. He's been the red zone goal line back when healthy the last month and a half. And they are facing a Detroit team that's given up an average of over 30 points per game to opponents their last 4 games. So the Detroit Lions, you talked a lot, Ryan, so tip of the cap there about how this was kind of a fraudulent good defense after they had some really impressive early showings, and then giving up over 120 points over their last 4 games kind of shows, especially when you look and notice that some of these offenses were like, well, the Bears, the Saints, the Packers, these are not top flight offenses either.
Yeah, something that something I want to mention here is 2 weeks ago, not this past week, the Lions basically played the same game against the Bears and the Packers. They should have lost to the Bears. They did lose to the Packers. Then their offense came out with a major surge against New Orleans this week. Hat tip to them. Very talented, well-rounded unit. But like you said, Josh, that average defense let the Saints crawl back into it late. What's more concerning is that the Saints haven't been able to finish drives all year, but they could last week against Detroit. So what are you thinking about Detroit in general and with their defense in particular? Is this a team we should be targeting against with streamers and anything else?
Yeah, I think they're starting to become a nice shootout component for games, simply because we know this is a very good offense, and we're starting to realize that this defense struggles just in general. And teams are also going to have to play more aggressively when facing a good offense like the Lions. I think one thing that's going to be difficult is knowing who has the bigger game between Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. Last week, I had them ranked back-to-back, Montgomery just ahead of Gibbs, and simply because they were favored versus the Saints. Sure enough, that came true. Montgomery got there, but I'm not necessarily sure if the way it all happened is exactly what I expected. So I think they are both top 15 running backs for fantasy each week. I'm not quite sure who the guy is this week. I would lean Montgomery given this matchup, but it wouldn't really surprise me if Gibbs is the one that gets it done more. So I think just in general, we start both these guys each week. But in terms of knowing who's going to have the bigger game, that's a little tougher. At the end of the day, though, they both are averaging just over 16 PPR fantasy points per game. So that's kind of low-end RB1 territory. And then the last note is that just a fun fact, but Sam Laporta had a 36% target share this past week. But more impressively, his 140 receiving yards were 66% of Jared Goff's total passing yards. So I didn't quite finish running those numbers. I believe that is either highest, if not second highest this year. So congrats, Sam Laporta, having 2/3 of your team's receiving yards in a game.
That's Larky Tweets. You can find his fantasy rankings on the website tomorrow afternoon, the33rdteam.com. I'll provide defensive rankings. Kev Wheeler and Matthew Hill's rankings will be in there as well. Next up, Josh, Jets versus Texans. Jets opened as 6-point home underdogs. They're already 6.5-point home underdogs. Game totals down from 36.5 to 34.5. You know, the story's the same for the Jets. High-end defense, unimaginably bad offense. Now we're talking about inserting Zach Wilson back at quarterback. What are you thinking with the Jets offense here, Josh?
Yeah, I like that Zach Wilson is reluctant to start. I think that might be the first time I've ever heard that in the NFL. Supposedly, it's because he thinks he's going to get injured behind this offensive line. I'm not quite sure if I buy that. Other way, I think when you have an offense that's been atrocious and then you're reinserting, like you said, a quarterback in there who doesn't even seem like he wants to play for this team right now, I can't see how the Jets are scoring more than maybe one touchdown against the Texans this week. The past 7 games, Breece Hall has been maybe the least efficient runner in football. He's averaged 12 carries per game the past 7 games, and he has 28 rushing yards a game. That is under 2.4 yards per carry. Still gets there pretty much every week in fantasy because he's averaged over 6 targets, over 5 catches, and 41 receiving yards per game. So I think I have not seen this before, that a running back can average 28 rushing yards per game with no touchdown equity, yet has averaged nearly 15 fantasy points per game over those past 7.
Yeah, it's a bad situation in New York. You know, no quarterbacks, threatens defenses whatsoever. Can key in on Breece Hall. You know, thankfully we get points for receptions. The Texans, Josh, I won't say they're a well-rounded team because I don't think they have a very good running game, but high-end passing attack now. And the defense has won another game last week, Josh, against Denver. That's 4 or 5 games this year now where the Texans defense has played a very big role in a victory. Now for the offense, Josh, I think Tank Dell's their most dynamic pass catcher. He's out for the rest of the year. What does that do to this offense? And who do you think benefits the most from his absence?
So what we saw this past week is that Nico Collins had a 46% target share. That was 12 targets. He caught 9 for 191 yards and a touchdown. We shouldn't expect that. But I do think Collins can have a target share that closes in on 30% rest of season. And we sort of know that Collins is the top target from earlier in the season. And then also Tank Dell did break his leg after only 4 routes. So we got pretty much that entire game without Dell. Brevin Jordan was filling in for Dalton Schultz, who was out with an injury. Brevin Jordan had a 15% target share. He caught 3 of his 4 targets for 64 yards. I would expect Dalton Schultz to kind of ping pong with Noah Brown, who the second pass game option is. Dalton Schultz is an every week fantasy tight end 1 whenever he's healthy. Noah Brown should at least have flex appeal in general. I think this week I'd be pretty concerned to start him against the Jets, since Noah Brown as the wide receiver 2 is going to face some pretty difficult coverages. But weeks 15 and 17, the Texans get the Tennessee Titans friendly secondary. So I think Noah Brown, if he's on waivers, that's a great pickup. We'll talk about him more tomorrow. I think the Tank Dell injury is probably going to hurt CJ Stroud the most. I still think he's an every week fantasy starter in the playoffs, but week 14, for example, all of my fantasy rankings out tomorrow. I'm not quite sure if Stroud will be in the top 12, given that there's going to be no Tank Dell against the Jets. I think he's probably going to be a fringe quarterback one. So I think maybe you search for other options week 14. We'll start him in the fantasy playoffs. One other note, you mentioned the broken run game. I have concern for Devin Singletary. I think I was a little bit too confident that after his good performances, he'd be the lead back. Dameon Pierce is the one who had 15 carries to Singletary's 8 this past week. Dameon Pierce is the one who had 4 red zone rush attempts to Singletary's 1. And Singletary only ran a few more routes in the pass game. So ultimately what we saw last week was that Dameon Pierce scored more fantasy points, and deservedly so given the usage. Those are both going to be incredibly hard players to rank, given that we're going to probably want to start at least one of them since the Jets are a struggling run defense. But right now I am truly not sure who it's going to be. Do you have a lean based on how they looked last week?
I've always thought that Pierce is the better runner, and it would make sense if Singletary had more of a, last year, Pierce should have a Pacheco type role for last year's Chiefs offense, and Singletary should have the McKinnon role, is how I see it. And if the Jets were playing the Texans on a night game, I'd play both of them in a showdown lineup, is how I'd frame that. Next up, Saints for Panthers. Saints were minus 5.5 point home favorites about 24 hours ago. Right now they're down to -5. Game totals here 38.5. If the Chargers are the most disappointing team this year, Josh, the Saints are 1A. This division was theirs for the taking. They have the best roster, the best quarterback in the division. They've just consistently failed. I don't really have a problem with them losing to the Lions last week, but they got the doors blown off early in that game where they were basically playing from behind and drawn dead for most of that contest. Now Carr's back in concussion protocol, which means, let's assume Jameis Winston starts, Josh. What does that mean for this Saints offense?
Yeah, ultimately, I think Jameis Winston's not quite as fantasy friendly as some think. I think he's probably best just for Chris Olave. Chris Olave is a very fast player, often with a high average depth of target. That aligns well with Jameis Winston's skill set. But even still, Chris Olave's had back-to-back games now with at least 114 yards playing with Derek Carr. So I don't think us just saying, well, Jameis Winston's going to solve everything. Well, the last 4 games, Chris Olave's had 16.5, 21, 18, and 17 PPR fantasy points. That's almost entirely with Derek Carr. So I think Chris Olave is still a low-end fantasy wide receiver 1. And I think the other player we start here is simply Alvin Kamara. I will most likely not be streaming Jameis Winston in any of my leagues. Whether even if I needed streamers, which I probably might in 1 or 2 leagues, but Carolina Panthers, the worst matchup for fantasy quarterbacks because they cannot score and their pass defense is actually all right. Really, it is a run funnel defense. I think the sneaky play here might be that someone like Jamal Williams becomes flex worthy, but I'm mostly just going to look at Kamara and Olave here.
I release my expert picks on Thursday mornings, and then I release my finalized versions for winter pools, survivor pools, so on and so forth on Saturday mornings. One of the games I'm looking forward to tackling the most is this one, because from the Panthers side, they were feisty last week. They gave the Buccaneers a game in Tampa Bay. And if Jameson Winston plays in this contest, last season when he faced the Panthers, he played one of the worst games I've ever seen. It's why they've avoided playing him at any cost since from that game. So if he's the starter as expected, I'll probably be a little bit overweight on the Panthers and winter pools. So be sure to check that out later in the week if you're involved in those. Now, Josh, I don't think we have any optimism for the Panthers offense at all. We're basically looking forward to next season. Correct me if I'm wrong in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, this was their first game since head coach Frank Reich was fired. Jonathan Mingo led the team with a 39% target share. He caught 6 of 10 targets for 69 yards. Thielen was second with a 23% target share, 6 targets. I think the days of Adam Thielen crushing in fantasy might be beyond us. I'm not saying that we should be starting Mingo or that he's the clear wide receiver 1, but given how terrible this pass attack is, if we're not just funneling 40% of the targets to Adam Thielen each week, then there's nobody we should be starting in the pass attack. And in the first game without Frank Reich, Chuba Hubbard had almost all the touches. Miles Sanders kind of faded. Chuba had 25 carries to Sanders 8. Chuba had 2 red zone carries and 3 goal line carries. Miles Sanders was not allowed to touch the football in the red zone. So Chuba Hubbard in a game like this against the Saints, who are a decent run D, probably a low-end fantasy RB2 based on volume. We can just continue to ignore Miles Sanders.
That's Larky tweets. I got to be honest, Josh. Neither one of us liked Miles Sanders entering the year. I didn't think, I think we both thought it was going to be a 50-50 committee of sorts. I don't think either of us thought that Miles Sanders would be like a relative non-factor in this offense, given the amount of money they paid him. Next up, Browns versus Jaguars. Browns are 3-point home underdogs. Game total's gone down from 38 to 36.5. You know what? We talked about this, before it happened. This team's better with Joe Flacco. I actually think they can make the playoffs with Flacco. They don't need a lot on offense. Everyone says the Jets should have called them, and they should have, but let's just keep in mind that they have a new offensive coordinator. That's probably why they didn't. But my wish remains for January in the playoffs is for Joe Flacco's Browns to go into Baltimore and knock off the Ravens. I think that would be hilarious. What are we thinking about the Browns in fantasy, though, Josh?
Yeah, we talked about this multiple times, how Joe Flacco might be the answer. He unfortunately didn't really provide all that much fantasy relevance for any specific pass catcher, but he did have 254 passing yards, which was the second highest passing yards total of a Browns quarterback all season. And he threw 2 touchdowns, which I believe Deshaun Watson did once, and no other quarterback was able to muster. So Joe Flacco certifiably better for fantasy football as expected than a PJ Walker, Dorian Thompson, Robinson type mix. Elijah Moore was the one he targeted most with 12 targets. Moore caught 4 for 83 yards. Nobody else reached a 15% target share. I was bullish on Amari Cooper because of Joe Flacco. I didn't get it right this week. He only had a 12% target share, caught 3 for 34 yards. But I will probably go back to the well with some Amari Cooper props because they'll probably be lower than last week after Elijah Moore, rather than Amari Cooper was the main target guy. But I think in general, we should be much more bullish on this pass attack with the switch to Flacco. And considering that they're playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who play tonight, so they'll be on a short week, and they are a clear pass funnel defense.
Like you said, we'll see the Jaguars tonight. The one thing I have on their front is I could see them leaning on Travis Etienne a bit in this game because the Browns are a better pass defense than run defense. Do you have any other tidbits like that, Josh?
That's what I was going to mention too, is that unless we see Etienne get 30 touches in this game tonight for some reason, which I think Dearness Johnson and Tank Bigsby will get the mop-up duty. So assuming Etienne has 20 or fewer touches, then I agree. I think he gets leaned on super heavily.
Next up, Josh, NFC South battle. Big time stuff here. Falcons 2.5-point home favorites. Game's up from 39 to 30.5 points. The Falcons beat the Jets by default last week just because New York doesn't have anything even resembling a functioning offense. But you have to give the Falcons credit here. They've taken care of business over the last 2 weeks. They've won 2 games. They stand on top of the NFC South all by themselves. What do you got for us on Atlanta, Josh?
Yeah, we'll give a Bijan Robinson positive. We've been pretty negative towards his usage, but I think he might be a bell cow. The last 3 games, he's averaged 19 carries and 4 targets per game. That's 23 opportunities per game over his past 3, and he's averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game over that stretch as well. So the usage has been there. The fantasy points have been there. I think some might look and say, well, we over those past 3 games, we still had 14 combined carries per game from Tyler Algier and Cordell Patterson. Sure, that's fine. This is an extreme offense when it comes to how run heavy they are, which is what you should do when Desmond Ridder's your quarterback. I'm perfectly fine with Cordell Patterson and Tyler Algier getting 14 carries a game when Bijan's getting 19 himself. I think this is one of the rare situations where rather than looking at backfield share to determine if a guy is elite for fantasy usage, we should simply look at the counting stats. Bijan Robinson most certainly has had that these past 3 games.
Thankfully, we finally, Josh, it's the way it should be in Atlanta in their backfield, at least for now. We can't fully trust this guy yet. For the Buccaneers, let me frame this to you this way, Josh. The 2 teams that I'm the most angry with are the Chargers and the Saints. The teams that I have the most trouble watching are the Giants, the Jets, the Patriots, and the Panthers. But my least favorite team to watch is the Buccaneers. I think last week best embodied that stance. They escaped the Carolina Panthers, who just fired their coaching staff at home, beat them by 3. That said, Josh, the Buccaneers have some pretty good tools on offense. So what are we thinking here in this matchup?
Yeah, I think this is one of those where the Falcons aren't necessarily on paper this great defense to target for fantasy points. But once you start to adjust for opponents, because the Falcons and Saints schedules are so much easier than everyone else, it starts to become clear that this is not a particularly terrifying pass defense. Mike Evans, 84.3 yards per game this year, is actually the 3rd highest of his career. At age 30 with Baker Mayfield, already over 1,000 yards. He's done that every season, and he already has 10 touchdowns through 12 games as well. He's the fantasy wide receiver one type. Chris Godwin remains just this low average depth of target, moderate target share flex play each week. And this is kind of what holds true with bad quarterbacks that we see time and time again. It's tough for more than one wide receiver to be fantasy relevant. A lesser quarterback like Baker Mayfield is more inclined to just lock on to his top option and force feed him. And it generally takes a better pure passer to be able to distribute and get to it more than just one read on each play.
Next up, Josh, Bengals versus Colts. Bengals are 2.5-point home underdogs. Game total here is 40.5. We'll see Cincinnati tonight, but I think they're in real danger of losing out through the rest of the year. I'm lower on them than most people are. I bumped them from my power rankings. I think I had them at 12 with Joe Burrow. I moved them to 25th in a heartbeat, when the reality is I really think they're like 30th. Just waiting for them to get there. So I think that gives us some opportunities, but they do have Jamar Chase. T. Higgins could be back. We have anything positive here for this offense?
Well, we'll watch them play against the Jaguars tonight. I'm curious in this matchup, since the Jaguars are such a pass funnel defense, kind of how they let Jake Browning let it rip. They're not playing for anything at this point, and I think they might as well see if he's the backup quarterback of their future, and at least try and keep Jamar Chase satisfied. T. Higgins, it seems like he's almost certainly out after this year, given the contract, and that they just paid Joe Burrow, and that they're about to have to pay Jamar Chase as well. So I'll be watching this one, but very, very little optimism for this offense, just like you.
Yeah, I know if T. Higgins plays in this game, I'm going to be looking to see what his number is. The bet is under, so we'll revisit that later this week. On the Colts side, Josh, again, this team is 7-5. They just won in overtime last week. If the season ended today, everyone says D'Amico Ryans, everyone says Dan Campbell. To me, it's Shane Steichen's coach of the year in a landslide. Gardner Minshew, Gardner Minshew's the lovable backup. I think everyone likes him. He's a gritty player. Again, this team having 7 wins is crazy. And, I'm going to give you a parallel, Josh, before I ask you about the Colts offense in general. Michael Pittman kind of mimics prime years Michael Thomas right now. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good one. We saw that last year a little bit too. I believe he had 99 receptions for like 850 yards last year. So he was the king of the slant last year. And we're seeing a lot more of that this year with the average depth of target and yards per reception. I like that parallel.
Yeah, something to keep in mind with Michael Thomas is he played with Drew Brees. So that's why his production numbers are crazy. But similar players, similar skill sets. Next up, Josh, 49ers Seahawks. I was very surprised by the line here. It was 49ers 11.5. It's moved to 10.5. My thing here is I know what 10.5 means when a sports book opens a line like that. I know what 9.5 means. I have no idea what 11.5 means. It's a very, very strange line. Game total's up from 46 to 47. No, here's the thing, Josh. This is the 49ers are the best, most complete team in the league. Deebo Samuel backed up his talk by going nuts against the Eagles last week. We talked about that on the prop show this week. I expected that. I've been on Brock Purdy's side since opening day when I saw him manage pressure against the Steelers. I don't think he's Patrick Mahomes, but I think he's better than most people do. For instance, I'd rather have Brock Purdy than Geno Smith, regardless of what team I'm on. But, he absolutely benefits from his supporting cast, but he's also good in pressure management. He's consistently accurate, and he puts this team in position to win every game, and he just, lit up one of the best teams in the league. What do you think about the 49ers, Josh?
One thing before we get to the Niners, we talked about this pre-show. We both have interest in the Colts -2.5 in that game. I don't think at this point the Bengals against any competent team should be within 3 points. So the fact that it wasn't -3, I bet that this morning. With the Niners, Christian McCaffrey gets there every single week in fantasy. We keep seeing that. And it's still frustrating because it's still 2 of Debo, Kittle, and Ayuk. So there's usually one that doesn't quite get there. You were very correct in being in on Debo. He had nearly 40 fantasy points yesterday. The Seahawks just happen to be a solid matchup for all the skill players. I don't have too much to add here, but when you're just for schedule, Seattle's the 9th best matchup for quarterbacks, 6th best matchup for running backs, 9th best matchup for wide receivers in fantasy football. We already know what this Niners offense is. We don't need to explain to people just how good it is, but it's worth noting that at least for the DFS folks out there, they are also just in a great spot as well. Ryan, before we talk about the Seahawks though, Brock Purdy just threw for over 300 yards, 4 touchdowns, no picks against the Eagles. He is now sitting as the MVP favorite at most sports books. Give us your thoughts here. You are the awards market guru on staff, and I assume that you have some kind of take on this one.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's weird about this is not much has changed for me over the last 3 weeks. I thought this race was Purdy and Dak Prescott, and I actually think Tyreek Hill should be third. Hurts hasn't been productive enough, but he has the path from a win, team success standpoint. They beat Dallas, they beat Seattle, they close out with Giants, Cardinals, Giants. They could end up as the number one seed, and if they do, quarterbacks for one of the number one seeds tend to win this award. If they don't, even, this is the rare instance where Matt Ryan's the last quarterback who wasn't the number one seed to win the MVP. I do think Dak Prescott and Brock Purdy both have a case there. Today, I'd lean a little bit in Dak's direction just from a pure productivity standpoint, but from a team success standpoint, I think the 49ers are going to end up better than Dallas. So I think I have Purdy at 22-1. I have Dak at 40-1 and 20-1 from before the season. So I'm good with either of them winning, and I think that's what we're looking at here.
Let's turn to the Seahawks. Geno Smith's best game of 2023 was last week on Thursday Night Football against the Cowboys. I don't think that continues, but I think it's worth noting DK Metcalf can just get there any week versus any defense because of his unique size speed combo. Zach Charbonnet was an elite bell cow for fantasy football. However, because this offense is pretty bad, and I think what we saw last week was kind of the anomaly, you ultimately need him to score for fantasy football. I get worried betting on weekly touchdowns for running backs and offenses we're not excited about. It's good to know the touches are pretty guaranteed. I wouldn't say the 49ers are a particularly good matchup for running backs, but we have to give Charbonnet credit for fantasy football. He had 19 of the 20 carries, and he ran slightly more routes than the pass catching back DJ Dallas. Ryan, any other Geno Smith thoughts? Have you changed your tune on him after he had his game of the year? Or are you still thinking this was the anomaly like I am?
No, yeah, I'm more in line with you. Like you said, he had a great performance against a very good defense. They kept him clean. He was good last year when he was kept clean, but that doesn't change the fact that he's been mediocre for most of the last 2 months. That said, one thing that I want to talk about in this game is Seattle's much more desperate than San Francisco. They don't quite need to win this game, but it's close. Their grasp on a wild card spot is slipping every week, so I could see them giving San Francisco more of a contested game, but ultimately Geno Smith determines how well this team does, and I don't have a ton of confidence in him. Next up, Josh, speaking of things I don't have a lot of confidence in, the Raiders versus the Vikings. Raiders were 2.5-point favorites when they are 2.5-point home underdogs when this opened. They're up to a full 3 points. Game totals down from 40.5 to 40 points. They've been scrappy under Antonio Pierce. You got to give them all the credit in the world there. They gave the Dolphins the game. They gave the Chiefs a game for half two. Aidan O'Connell's the primary issue here. Quarterback's the primary issue. Recent rumors that they're now fired GM wanted to trade up for CJ Stroud. Probably leaves a bit of a poor taste in people within the organization. What do you think about Vegas's offense, Josh? I don't really have a lot of confidence in that.
I don't have much confidence either. The Vikings have been an above average defense this year, pretty much across the board. They've been a little bit friendly to fantasy wide receivers compared to the other positions, simply because teams are passing more against the Vikings and realizing that they can't run. But with Aidan O'Connell, we can pretty much just start Devontae Adams. I've made a lot of mentions in the past about how Jacoby Myers was an elite fantasy start with Jimmy Garoppolo. And as we talk about, when quarterback play drops significantly, it's tough for multiple guys to get there in fantasy. He's become pretty much a non-factor. He's getting 2-3 catches most of these games with Aidan O'Connell. So we'll start Devontae Adams and we'll hope for the best. And I don't think we need to get cute in the passing game beyond that.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I just, Jacobs, Adams, that's it. With Minnesota, Josh, they're coming off a bye. Josh Dobbs has been mostly good all year. I say mostly good because he did have a nightmare game against the Bears before their bye. The idea that they may turn to Jaron Hall or Nick Mullins actually drives me a little insane. I can't believe that's on the table. We'll see later in the week if that actually happens. But, what are you thinking with Minnesota in general, especially with the quarterback potential flux here?
Yeah, I had the same thought. Josh Dobbs had a terrible game. He threw 4 picks against the Bears, but Jaron Hall, really, when you look at the draft capital and the profiles of the other quarterbacks on this roster, it doesn't make any sense why a team that's still in the wild card hunt would do anything other than stick with Dobbs. Last note, the Raiders are actually like kind of a solid defense. Their secondary is actually held up nicely, and I think part of that's just because of their pass rush. Ryan, I know you've talked a lot about how the Raiders pass rush is actually quite decent. The one area they struggle is against running backs. They're the 7th best matchup when you adjust for schedule for fantasy running backs. I hate to say it, Ryan. I hate to say it. Alexander Madison's going to be a fantasy start this week. We'll actually have our first start sit column of the year. We're going to add that. The people have been requesting it. We'll have that start sit column, and I hate to say it, but I already picture myself writing 200 words on why we'll be starting Alexander Madison, and I'm dreading my week 14, dreading it.
Yeah, I'm going to stay completely away from that one. That's all you, buddy. But, to this point, you have been right about him. So if you want to start him, then that means he's probably a guy you lock in your DFS lineups this week. Next up, Josh, your beloved Chargers versus the Denver Broncos is, from the city you hail now. Chargers, 3-point favorites. Game totals down from 44.5 to 43.5. The great irony of the Brandon Staley era, Josh, is over the last 2 games, I feel like that's the best the Chargers defense has played under him. They limited Lamar Jackson. They shut out the Patriots in New England. Now, on offense, Josh, they have nothing outside of Keenan Allen. Austin Eckler does not look like Austin Eckler. I don't know if that's a temporary injury-related thing or it's just, running backs get too much tread on the tires and things start to go south. The other thing I want to touch on, Josh, is Quentin Johnson starting to head towards Jalen Reagor territory. Another atrocious big-time drop in that game last week. Obviously, Justin Herbert's still a premium quarterback, but do we have any kind of hope of this offense getting things right down the stretch here?
Yeah, Quentin Johnson, I believe this was, we could probably call this his second best game of the year in terms of production. He did have a 19% target share. He caught 5 for 52 yards. Like you said, the stat line should have been better because of that crucial drop. I think at this point, we're going to need to see a pretty massive shift from what he does this year to next year to have any interest for year 2. I think we can kind of close the book on his rookie season at this point. And then I also just wanted to give you props. You took Keenan Allen under 90.5 receiving yards on the prop show. I don't think that was a particularly popular pick to bet against the fantasy wide receiver 2 on the season. And he was well below that in a game that ended 6-0. So as we talked about, we should be kind of betting against large offensive numbers anytime a team like the Patriots is involved.
Yeah, when they're opponent specific, man, especially with a team that has one real, producer, you gotta take shots here and there, even if they're uncomfortable. Jets versus Bills is up next, Josh. A great game with some pretty high stakes for Buffalo, who needs to win this one. Chiefs opened as 3-point favorites. They're down to 2.5 right now. Game total opened at 48, down to 47.5. Josh, that was a bad loss in Green Bay yesterday for the Chiefs. I've given them the benefit of my doubt in my power rankings at this point. I'm going to push them down to 8th unless Jacksonville somehow loses tonight. And, a big thing that I noticed, and we talked about this before the show, that really surprised me is Green Bay was ripping holes open in the running game, which they really haven't been able to do all year. So I think, maybe a big question here for the Chiefs is, was this like a regression to the mean game for their defense where they've been overachieving all year and this is, just a bad outing where they correct to a degree? Or is Kansas City suddenly a team that has a volatile offense with a great quarterback and, closer to like the 10th defense and the 3rd best defense?
Yeah, that's kind of my concern as well. I watched the condensed game this morning and we talked pre-show and I said my biggest takeaway from that was they were dominated on the trenches kind of on both sides. And when it's Patrick Mahomes with not much skill position talent, where Travis Kelce still looks good, but Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's starting to look a little bit more like a 34-year-old tight end than I think like last year's 33 was a lot younger and healthier looking than this year's 34.
Yeah.
And it almost looks like Pacheco's their most dynamic offensive player, which is very concerning. Rashee Rice has been nice. He's good. But to have him as your wide receiver 1 when he's a second-round rookie, that's not exactly what you want. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if the Bills won this one personally, where they have the entire bye week to relax, and then they watch the Chiefs get dominated by the Packers, and they think, you know what, we're rested, we're healthy. We're going to execute a similar game plan with a much better quarterback in Josh Allen.
Yeah, normally I'm a big component of teams that right the ship, like teams like Kansas City anyway, perennial contenders that right the ship after a bad loss. I think Buffalo's going to win this game too. And to another thing here, Josh, we talked about this before. The Bills probably have to win out. And if they win out, it's probably going to be because Josh Allen goes crazy down the stretch. At 35-1 type is odds in the MVP market. I don't think he has a pretty narrow path, but I don't think he's drawn dead, but Buffalo does have to win out. You have any enthusiasm for Buffalo's offense? Can they win this game? Like you just said that you think they can. And can that success continue through the rest of the year?
Yeah, I'm probably going to be a little bit ahead of consensus on a lot of the Bills this week. Just kind of what we've been talking about, where yes, the Chiefs are probably going to rebound in some way. I don't think the defense is going to play as bad as it did against the Packers, but with how much better the Bills offense is than the Packers and how good they looked those last 2 weeks prior to the bye, I'm going to be pretty bullish on all these Bills, especially the auxiliary options, just because I think this game environment can shape up pretty favorably for them, where the Bills secondary as well has actually been pretty disappointing all season, partially because of injuries. So I think this could be kind of a shootout where the Bills end up on top.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think that's possible too. Another big one, Josh, Sunday Night Football, Cowboys versus Eagles. Cowboys open as 3-point home favorites. That's moved to 3.5, which is actually pretty surprising to me. Game total's gone up from 51.5 to 53 points. We talked about this before, Josh. Dak's the MVP favorite right now. Him and Brock Purdy are at the top of this market. So my bank account wants Dallas to win every game for the rest of the season. Make like $6,000-$7,000 off Dak Prescott. I'm good with that. But I do think that Philly's in a bounce back spot here. A big key for Dallas is, can their offensive line mitigate Dallas or Philly's interior pass rush? If they can, Philly's beatable in the air. What are you thinking here for Dallas?
Yeah, at this point, through 13 games, the Eagles, when you adjust for schedule and opponents faced, are the number one best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks and the number one best matchup for fantasy wide receivers as well. We will confidently start Dak Prescott, of course, and CeeDee Lamb, but also Brandon Cooks, who we've talked about for several weeks now, continues to produce in fantasy. So we'll give ourselves a little pat on the back for noticing that he's starting to look healthier and that he's been producing. And then, of course, Dalton Schultz, another smash start. Or not Dalton Schultz.
Jake Ferguson.
Jake Ferguson. Wow.
He may as well be Dalton Schultz. He may as well
I was going to say, we've called him the next iteration of Dalton Schultz so many times that in my notes, I wrote Schultz with some Ferguson stats set up. So I guess we had a nice little one there, but yeah, I'm going to be starting that quattro of Dak, Lamb, Cooks, Schultz, or Cooks, Ferguson with high conviction this week against the Eagles. And I kind of wish this was on the main slate for DFS. So it's disappointing for me, at least, that I'll have to play this one in Showdown.
I agree there too. And, I've done the Schultz thing too. It's week 14, Josh. No harm, no foul. Eagles, for the Eagles side of things, Josh, obviously last week's loss to the 49ers wasn't good because since this came in such decisive fashion. But, it's not the end of the world for me. Philly was coming off an overtime win against Buffalo where they basically had to empty the chamber to get to that one. I like to bet against teams off that situation, which is why one of the reasons I like San Francisco last week. The other one was that game was personal, genuinely personal for San Francisco. In this matchup, the Eagles' offensive line can mitigate Dallas's pass rush similar to how Seattle did. I think that's their path to victory. Similarly, if you're going to say which wide receiver in the league's the closest to being an athletic freak like DK Metcalf, it's A.J. Brown. So I'm curious, Josh. Philly has a lot of ways they can beat you on offense. Well, which ones do you like?
Yeah, we'll actually talk about this the other way. We'll talk about who I was concerned about because I like A.J. Brown and I like Devonta Smith. We've talked about how Devonta Smith was going to surge. He, sure enough, has indeed surged. Dallas Goedert might return this week. That's something to monitor. I would imagine they keep him out one more week just to make sure he's fully healthy. The Eagles are definitely making the playoffs. I think the last thing they want is to rush a guy back from a broken forearm only for him to get re-injured. But yeah, concerned with DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift has been the bell cow for this offense from week 2 onward. And then last week he was outsnapped by Kenny Gainwell. He had 6 carries to Gainwell's 2. And Gainwell ended up running far more routes. Part of that might have been the game script and just the overall situation. But the fact that Swift had so little run for a lot of this game was definitely concerning. I think he gets back on track in this one in terms of usage, but it's at least on my radar and should be on others' radars as well with DeAndre Swift, because if he's just going to be in a committee, then he's going to be a pretty frustrating and difficult fantasy start. And then before we turn to those 2 Monday night games, folks, follow Ryan on Twitter at Ryan Reynolds NFL. The guy watches every snap of every game. He applies his unique perspectives to fantasy to betting. He's the one that told you the Niners would be much more motivated, given that this was a rematch of that NFC Championship game that they lost in frustrating fashion. Remember, folks, that was the game where Purdy hurt his shoulder and then everything crumbled. And I think they were down by like 2 touchdowns. And I think they ran the ball like 25 straight times because they literally didn't have a quarterback. And sure enough, they came back with a vengeance. They smoked the Eagles last week. So not many others that can give that type of insight. Not many others that are watching every snap of every game and being able to put it into actionable content. So all of Ryan's work, the33rdteam.com, survivor thoughts, power rankings, picks and predictions for every game, and exactly what he's betting on in each and every game. That flagship piece comes out on Saturdays.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully I still live to tell about this, Josh, because as you guys may be able to tell, my voice is a little flying a little south right now. And like you said, Josh, 2 Monday night games. I have no idea why there's 2 Monday night games in week 14. I know we do this on opening day. I'm not sure why we're doing it on week 14. Thanks, artificial intelligence. I guess you guys it's another wrinkle you're giving us. Dolphins versus Titans is the first one. You know, they're both at 8:15 for some reason too. Dolphins 13-point favorites. It's moved up to 13.5 already. Game total's 47. You know, we know about the Dolphins offense, Josh. We knew this going into the season, but their defense is starting to creep up into being a top 10 unit, a difference-making unit every week. You know, to be perfectly honest with you, Josh, I actually think Miami might be the best team in the AFC right now. I think they can beat you in the most ways. You know, that said, Josh, let's talk about Tyreek Hill for a second here. I've thought he was the best receiver in the league for at least half a decade now. I have a tweet about it years ago that I don't care enough to dig it up, but I said this in public like years ago. And you nailed your bet on Tyreek Hill. I remember you mentioning the number 150 on the dot in a private conversation where you said, like, your only concern was, you know, Washington might not push them enough. You got that number. What are you thinking about Miami here, Josh?
Yeah, we barely hit that one because of game script. I posted that one in our free Discord. If anyone out there is on the 33rdteam.com, which you should be, our content this year is free. And even if it wasn't, I would say it's worth paying for. But all of our articles have that free Discord linked, and I dropped it in our free prop betting channel. I said, guys, Tyreek Hill's plus 725 to reach 150 yards. That was a nice little payday for anyone out there that was interested. I think what's so impressive, though, is the efficiency of Tyreek Hill. He had 5 catches for 157 yards and 2 touchdowns. This was on 18 routes. He barely had to play because they blew them out. He had 8.7 yards per route run. He was already leading the NFL in yards per route run. Any number above 2 is good. He was at nearly 9 this year. And I think the funniest part of all this is that one of his 5 receptions was for -6 yards in this game. So really, he had 4 catches for 163 yards on 17 routes. If we remove that abysmal play, which we won't do, we'll accept it was only 8.7 routes or yards per route run. One other note is the fantasy usage in the backfield. Devon Achane led the backfield when he returned from injury in snaps, carries, routes, 17 carries to Mostert's 11, 16 routes run to Mostert's 9. Achane is the preferred fantasy option. And that's why out there, a lot of people have been annoyed with where I've been ranking Raheem Mostert in my rest of season rankings. And I kept saying Devon Achane, when he's healthy, is the preferred option. And now we're looking to the fantasy playoffs. Dolphins are going to have a tough schedule. And Mostert's not even the lead back. So everyone out there that said, well, he's the fantasy RB2 in fantasy, so I simply have to rank him like a top 3 fantasy running back rest of season. This is why we don't do that. I saw this potentially coming, and sure enough, it happened immediately. And I think anyone out there that sees that Jeff Wilson led this backfield in red zone rush attempts, which he did this past week, should know that all of them came in the fourth quarter because it was a blowout. Jeff Wilson, by far the third option in this run game. It is Achane, then it is Mostert. I do not care that all 4 of Wilson's carries came in the red zone. It was when the game was blown out. It did not matter.
Tennessee, Josh, I'm going to say 2 things that are positive. Obviously teams want to win football games, but it does look like they're going to be in position to take one of the 2 premium left tackles in this year's draft. That looks like that's going to happen. That's good for them. Then when we had Mike Tannenbaum on the show early in the offseason, we discussed how we're all Tajay Spears guys. Looks like Tajay Spears is going to get a shot now, Josh. What are you thinking about that and the Titans offense in general?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting here. The Miami defense is kind of a pass funnel defense. So it could help out with Spears's receiving skill set. I think he might be the one to benefit, at least for fantasy football. I just don't have much confidence in Will Levis and this pass attack in general. So I think we just need to keep in mind that this Titans offense, at least for the rest of this year, is going to be limited by their offensive line and by Will Levis being a rookie quarterback who's probably just not a long-term starter in the NFL.
Yeah, I agree. I think they might be stuck with him for another year, but yeah, I agree. The other Monday Night Football game, Giants versus Packers. Spreads here is Giants 6.5-point home underdogs. Game total here is 37. Giants, Tommy DeVito. I mean, they've won 2 games. It hasn't been because of their offense. It's been because of their defense. Saquon Barkley's seen pretty massive usage. Do you have anything? Well, let me say this too. Jalen Hyatt, I mentioned this weeks ago. Jalen Hyatt's going to be volatile for the rest of this year, but if you're in Dynasty and you can get him cheap, I would. He's going to be a difference maker. Not sure he's going to be a volume monster, but he's going to be a difference maker. Anything positive to say about the Giants here, Josh?
First, let's go back to the Titans. Breaking news. I just found out that Derrick Henry, after being announced earlier today that he was in concussion protocol, it was announced he's no longer in concussion protocol. I don't quite know what's going on here, but still a very, very, very risky spot to start the big dog. He's had back-to-back games with at least 20 fantasy points, but the 2 before that, he had back-to-back games below 6. Game script against the Dolphins when they are 13-point underdogs is probably not going to be in his favor. And I would say that this is a very risky start. And a guy, yeah, I mean, why are we trying to get excited about an older running back coming off of 2 big workloads, now in a game where he's a 13-point underdog, and he might possibly still be slightly concussed? Turning to the Giants, they were just on bye for week 13. Saquon Barkley's facing a run funnel Packers defense. He's probably a low-end fantasy RB2 based on usage. Jalen Hyatt had 6 targets last week, or 2 weeks ago before their bye. He caught 5 for 109 yards. That's a 20, and he had a 21 average depth of target. So having 6 targets, 21 yards down the field's a positive. I'd say he's kind of the Hail Mary play for fantasy football. But other than Saquon is a low-end fantasy RB2, and maybe you're flexing Jalen Hyatt and just crossing your fingers, I really don't have much optimism in this Giants offense, even coming off of their bye.
For Green Bay, you got to give them credit. They've knocked off the Lions and Chiefs in the last 2 weeks. The game last week was a pretty decisive win, actually. They were kind of in control the whole way. Very, very, that was unexpected, I'll say. Like we mentioned before, their running game was more successful than I was expecting, but, I wouldn't call Jordan Love a great quarterback by any stretch of the imagination, but he's been pretty good over the last month. He's put this team back in the wild card race. What are you thinking about him and this passing attack going forward, Josh?
Yeah, I think just as we're about to get excited about Jordan Love, we get hit with that end of game Christian Watson hamstring injury. I'm curious if he misses time. I will assume he misses time, but I think that's actually a big factor. Even though he's been pretty inconsistent, at least for fantasy football, much more important for real football to at least have a respected deep threat. Jaden Reed and Romeo Doubs should not really be your top 2 receivers. And even though the Giants don't really have all that much of a pass defense, it's hard to get super excited about Jordan Love spike weeks when the Giants won't be able to keep pace with them in general. And that Jordan Love will be down his most dynamic option in the pass game. The thing I'm curious about for fantasy is if Aaron Jones returns. They've been pretty quiet about his injury. A.J. Dillon actually looked decent yesterday on Monday night, or on Sunday night, but I think part of that was just the run blocking, which I think we might be able to see that advantage again here. So I'll be interested in the Green Bay run game, and I'll be interested in Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed because of target consolidation. But I think I'll actually be a little bit less excited about Jordan Love because I don't think they're going to need to do much versus the Giants, and he just lost his top pass game option. And folks, that'll do it from us here for our Week 13 recap, looking ahead to Week 14 NFL action. From myself, Josh Larky, from my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Our work is on the33rdteam.com. Thank you, everyone.